wasting time. Welcome back to the Realty Rundown. This is episode 22 titled, What Are Closing Costs? What Buyers and Sellers Need to Know. I am your host, Nic Wyse, and with me as always is my co-host, Nathan Schwartz.
That's right. Hey, everyone. Today's episode is all about something that surprises a lot of people in a real estate transaction, and that would be closing costs. Whether you're buying or selling, you're going to have some expenses due at closing, but what exactly are those and how much should you expect?
Exactly. So we're going to try and break it down for you step by step. What closing costs are, what buyers typically pay, what sellers are responsible for, and then there's some variation depending on the loan type, the agreement, sometimes the location. So just trying to give you insight so you guys can avoid any surprises when you get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with the basics. So closing costs are simply just fees and expenses both buyers and sellers pay to complete a real estate transaction. So they're due at closing when the title transfers and the deed is finalized or the deal is finalized.
That's right. Yep. So it's always something we tell people when we're getting ready to list a property or, when they're getting ready to buy. As a buyer, sometimes you may have some expenses, but typically there's no money changing sides. There's no money moving anywhere until closing.
Yep.
The advertising typically is paid by the agent. We always cover all advertising. It's up to every agency what they do, but that's how we handle it. So yeah, these costs are always at closing. And again, you've got your title work fees in here, your origination fees in here for your mortgage, basically to get the loan. Taxes, insurance are going to be paid typically and collected at closing. Not always. Some people choose not to escrow their taxes and insurance. If you're like me, I don't, because I'm a control freak and I want to make sure everything is just so and it's paid and I track it. So I don't. We don't mortgage. We don't include that in our mortgage. And then, of course, real estate commissions obviously are typically included at the time of closing as well. So you can kind of think of these, I guess, as fine print items. They're not something that you really think about when you start a real estate transaction, but they are eventually paid when you finalize that home sale.
Yeah. And as the buyer, here's what you could expect to pay in Indiana and most Midwestern markets, but specifically here in Indiana. So your loan origination fee is going to vary about 0.5% to 1% of the loan amount. So not necessarily the purchase price, but your loan amount. Appraisal fee, $400 to $600. Your credit report and underwriting fees could vary again, $100 to $300. Title insurance and search fees, $600 to $1,200. And homeowners insurance for the first year, that varies quite often, but anywhere between $800 to $1,500, which I've more so been seeing more towards that $1,500 figure. So, and then, prepaid taxes and escrow. So typically you're going to see 2 to 3 months worth of taxes there. And your recording fees, $50 to $150. And then if applicable, maybe some attorney's fees. We've seen them in some cases around $500. And then there's some miscellaneous fees. But in total, as the buyer, you're going to typically see about 2 to 5% of the home's purchase price in regard to your closing costs.
Yep. And I threw an image up here on the screen for everybody. And it's AI generated, so you can look for the little AI typo on there. You'll find it. It's glaring once you see it. It's like you can't look away from it. That's the numbers in essence are pretty accurate for what you can expect to pay as a buyer. So for example, like Nate mentioned, on $250,000 home, somewhere between $5,000 to $12,500 in closing costs for the buyer side. We certainly recommend, highly recommend getting some kind of a loan estimate early on in the process, like when you first meet with your lender to get your pre-approval. A good lender is typically going to give you some kind of an estimate, a good faith estimate, as they would call it. In fact, they have to be within a certain range. And since I don't know off the top of my head what that range is, I think it's 10%. I was like, I'm not going to say it. And then I just did. But I think they have to be within like a 10% margin of error on that. So if they estimate your closing costs are going to be $5,000 and they end up being $6,000, they're not within that margin. Or, they wouldn't be. So I think they have to make like adjustments on their end. So they would have to reduce some of their closing costs, maybe their loan origination fee. They have to take a little bite out of that. Then on the seller side, and again, these are just expected expenses that can vary widely, just in price or also what's actually included and who's paying for it. But again, these are typical transactions, what we're seeing. So sellers have their own set that's separate from a buyer's. In Indiana, typically it's going to be a real estate commission. There is no standard commission. There's not. But on average, it tends to come in between 5% and 6% of the total sales price. And that is typically split between the buying agent and the listing agent. We won't get too much into that because obviously the law changed. We've talked about that on a past episode, how the law in Indiana has changed and how commissions are handled and how they are negotiated. I think it really fell into a nice place where it's very clear now to both the buyer and the seller that commissions are negotiable. So they're no good. These are standard. These are just no standard. I mean, no, I just said they're standard. I'm getting sued. Should never have even talked about commission, but it's typically there. As we know, even for sale by owner properties, typically bring in an agent at some point. I think it's like 88% of them that try to sell themselves end up bringing in an agent to help get the deal closed and end up paying some commission. So you can expect it. Title insurance obviously is another big cost. And this again, it's kind of a percentage based thing. So, the lower purchase price of the home is typically going to have much lower title insurance because that's what they're insuring. So if it's a big old home, $1 million home, it's going to have a big old title insurance policy. It's going to be a couple $1,000s, maybe even $3,000 once you start traipsing up there in value. Again, we've covered title insurance and what it does, but feel free to ask us questions if you're still unsure, or go back and watch that past episode of the Realty Rundown. Property taxes owed up until closing. So they'll prorate these up right until the day before closing. That's the last date of ownership, even though say you're closing at 4:00 in the afternoon for tax proration purposes, they're actually calculating them from the day prior to closing. So those will be credited to the buyer. And in Indiana, where we pay our taxes in arrears, that's usually a pretty big amount because you typically got all the prorated taxes for that year. So like right now, if we're closing a property today, they would escrow 4 months of taxes that have accumulated, plus typically last year's taxes that are not yet due and paid. So that would be like fall taxes are not yet due in Indiana and paid. So they're typically going to be credited to the buyer as well. Then it's the buyer's responsibility to pay those. Sometimes if you're in a neighborhood with an HOA, you're going to have HOA transfer fees. I've seen this be, $250. Sometimes it can be a substantial little amount, often paid by the seller, but again, negotiable. Mortgage payoff, prepayment penalties. So the mortgage payoff is just what it sounds like. The title company is going to pay that mortgage off at the time of closing. We really like to have them handle it because we make sure that it's a relevant amount. And then prepayment penalties are really rare in Indiana because your standard Indiana mortgage is not going to have prepayment penalties. But you may have a private mortgage that does. You may have, some other mortgages that will have those prepayment penalties. So if you don't run the full 30 years, you have to pay some kind of penalty to close out that mortgage. And then your settlement, or in many states, they refer to it as an escrow fee. And there are different types of escrow fees. We just had one yesterday where the seller was unable to get some repairs completed by the time of closing. So they escrowed money to set aside. So if the repairs are going to be more than we had already set aside to pay the contractor, there was another $1,500 there to cover if there are additional expenses. To do that, to set that money in escrow at the title company, there was a fee. It was a $250 fee just to have that money sitting there. So that's one of the fees that you don't see a lot, but it can happen. The settlement fee is, pretty standard. You're going to see that on every closing. If you're closing out a title company and they're doing a nice insured closing for you, there's going to be a fee to do that. Again, on here, $300 is typically on the low side. You might see that for a cash transaction. If there's a lender involved, probably going to push that to more $400, maybe $450, or even $500 in this area. If you go over to St. Joe, they're a little higher. So that's why you see the $800 on there. So again, what you can expect as a seller when you're getting ready to sell your home and you get that market analysis. If you get one from us, it's going to include a net sheet with these numbers all in it, which is very handy. But you might not if you don't work with the Nic Wyse team. So you can expect to pay about 6 to 8% of the sales price in your closing costs.
Yeah. So basically, if you're selling a $300,000 house, you're probably looking between $18,000 to $24,000 in total closing costs, depending on your loan and whether you have any additional taxes or fees.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And just to kind of reiterate again, closing costs can be negotiated. This is the usual that we've kind of expressed here, but it's not uncommon for, a buyer to request that the seller pay some of their closing costs. We've done some of this in a previous episode, so I don't want to go too far into it, but the seller can contribute to the buyer's closing costs. They cannot pay for their down payment, but they can contribute to their closing costs. And that varies by your loan package. Like a conventional loan, if you put down less than 10% on a conventional loan, I think you're capped out at 3% that the seller can contribute.
So,
However, if you're putting down, I think it's over 25%, they can even go up to 9% that they can contribute, if your closing costs are that high. The other thing that you can do with those, if the seller's willing to pay some money towards your closing costs, you can actually use that money to buy down your rate. You can do like a 2-1 buy down. And again, we've talked about that a little bit in the past, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but there are ways to get your rate lower, either temporarily or permanently by buying it down. There's a cost to do that. So you can have the seller help you out with that. That's a great way to do it. VA caps out at 4% they can contribute. And I think FHA is at 6% that they can contribute.
Yeah.
That's the most. Yep. So yeah, just a nice thing to help buyers, some of those early out-of-pocket expenses in addition to their down payment.
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the seller's losing money if the seller contributes towards the buyer's closing costs. Sometimes they'll agree to cover closing costs in exchange for a slightly higher purchase price. But again, it all just depends on the deal.
It does. We certainly see that. Typically, if the buyer's going to ask for closing costs, they're almost certainly going to go in at asking price, or they should.
Yeah.
Unless it's been sitting out there for a long time, we're willing to throw an offer out there and see what sticks. But typically, it's going to be a full price offer, or sometimes they're going to go a little bit over. We just had that actually this week as well. Congrats to James and Naomi Troyer, who sold their house. We went pending on theirs this weekend. It's a VA buyer, and so the VA buyer said, "Hey, I'll give you $2,000 over your asking price for the home. We're pretty confident it'll appraise still for that." And then in return, they're paying $2,000 toward that VA buyer's closing costs. So tit for tat ends up being basically a break-even point for the seller. So again, just want to give, kind of a recap on some of this stuff. Quick tips, buyers, make sure you're getting that loan estimate early, understanding with your lender, walking you through every line item, what you're going to be paying. Sellers, you're going to be doing this more so with your agent. You're going to get that net sheet we talked about. That's going to break down all your expenses. We always like to do a high and a low end. So you're going to be getting two when you go with the Nic Wyse team. We're going to give you one kind of, like, let's shoot for the moon and go for this price. And then a little more like, hey, if we don't get it for that, this is probably more likely the sales price, your expenses, line item by line item. So you know what you're going to walk away from the table with at the end of the day. And also don't forget to budget for the other things that aren't really closing costs, moving costs, any repairs that the seller can be expected to make. As we mentioned, a lot of times those are included right on the settlement statement, paid through closing. Title company sends out a check to the contractor based off the invoice that they had sent in. Then of course, if you're selling your home, you got to figure in your next housing expenses too. So you've got your closing costs to sell, and then you may be turning right around and having closing costs to buy. And obviously, so closing costs, as you traditionally think of them, are a lot of things, and they're not necessarily the only expenses that you incur when you're buying and selling.
Yeah, exactly. And no one likes hidden fees. And with the right preparation, closing costs don't have to be a surprise. So whether you're buying or selling, understanding your numbers up front makes the whole experience much smoother.
That's right. All right, guys. Well, I think that's it for episode 22 of the Realty Rundown. Hope you understand a little bit more about your closing costs and what you can expect. So if you have any additional questions, by all means, reach out to us. We'll talk to you about closing costs, net sheets, planning for your next transaction. The Nic Wyse team is here to help. Until next time, guys, Nick knows. We'll get you wise replies.
That's right.